All right, guys, well, this is getting going. Let's review, since it has been a while since the last time. In the first half of chapter 16, we were going over some of the fundamentals about hormones in the endocrine system. So, what is the difference in how hormones are transported depending on whether they're water soluble or fat soluble?
If they're fat soluble, they need transport help, and then if they're water soluble, they can just go in the blood. Right?
Good. So water soluble hormones, which are the amino acid based ones, dissolve directly in the blood plasma. Fat soluble hormones, which are the steroid hormones and thyroid hormone, they require a transport protein. So back in chapter 17, at the very beginning of the semester when we were talking about plasma proteins, some of those act as carriers, and fat soluble hormones would be one of the things that utilize those. What about differences in how they activate receptors? How do water soluble hormones activate receptors?
They can just go in, right?
Well, actually, that's not the water soluble ones.
Oh, they can't just go in. That's
No, they can't. Water soluble hormones activate surface receptors and initiate changes that way. Fat soluble hormones enter the cell directly, activating intracellular receptors. Some of the specific components of the endocrine system that we discussed in the first half are the hypothalamus and the pituitary. What sort of hormones does the hypothalamus produce? You know what? Why don't we put a pin in that and talk about the pituitary for a second? The pituitary is divided into two parts, anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. There are hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary, although they're not created there. What are those two hormones?
They're releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones?
That's actually, hold on to that for a minute. That's going to be the answer to a question I ask in a second.
We have vacation brain.
I know.
It's bad.
So released from the posterior pituitary are oxytocin and ADH. But like I said, they're not actually produced there. So this is why I sort of moved on from the hypothalamus question. They are produced in the hypothalamus, transported through neurons, and then released from the posterior pituitary, although they're actually created in the hypothalamus. Now the anterior pituitary makes its own hormones. We talked about them before, things like thyroid stimulating hormone, ACTH, growth hormone, prolactin, a bunch of others, okay? But creation and release of those hormones in the anterior pituitary is regulated by what, Gwen?
Releasing hormones and inhibiting
Right,
hormones.
releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones that are made in the hypothalamus. So that first question I asked about what does the hypothalamus make? It makes releasing and inhibiting hormones to control the anterior pituitary, and then it also makes prolactin and ADH, which are transported to and then released from the posterior pituitary. Okay. Two of the anterior pituitary hormones are called gonadotropins. Do you remember which two those are?
Follicle stimulating. Is that what it's called?
Yeah, follicle stimulating hormone, which is FSH, and
LH and PRO.
no, LH is the other one. Yeah,
Oh,
so
okay.
prolactin's not technically a gonadotropin,
Oh,
although it's associated with reproduction. Gonadotropin, what does tropin mean?
Acting on?
Yeah, acting on, and then you usually name the other thing. So this is something directly acting on the gonads. Since prolactin acts on the mammary glands, it doesn't qualify. All right. So now let's pick back up and talk about some of the other glands of the body. In the hormonal axes, we're going to be looking at these glands would be considered like the last ones, right? So you always go hypothalamus, pituitary, and then some peripheral gland when you're dealing with one of those hormonal axes. So we're going to see those in here. We're also going to see the glands that are controlled by other means, because not everything is controlled by a hormonal stimulus, right? We also have what other two stimulus types besides hormonal?
nervous.
neural, right? And there's another one that's called humoral. So there's humoral, hormonal, and neural. In a humoral stimulus, a gland is releasing its hormone in direct response to the levels of something in the blood. We'll see some examples of that. Let's begin with the thyroid gland. Where's the thyroid gland located? Yeah, right here in your throat. For a little bit of reference, that piece of cartilage that's called the Adam's apple in men, or voice box in anybody, is the thyroid cartilage, and the thyroid gland is located a little bit inferior, but basically right over that. So over your trachea and larynx. It is kind of an H-shaped gland, so here we see a picture with two lobes on either side connected by a narrow isthmus. Here's what it looks like microscopically. The thyroid gland has a pretty unique microscopic appearance. You notice these large open areas. See these big areas of just solid pink? Those are called thyroid follicles, and they're large open areas sort of rimmed by these cells. You see follicular cells labeled. So these large rings encircle the follicles. They're like big holding tanks or cisterns in there. You know, big is comparative because we're on the microscopic level, but these large open areas within the glandular tissue called follicles, and that's actually where thyroid hormone is produced. Thyroid hormone is produced in kind of an unusual way. Most of the other hormones are made in a cell and then released to diffuse into the bloodstream. But it doesn't work that way with thyroid hormone. We'll get to its mechanism of production in just a second. But let's discuss the hormone itself. When we say thyroid hormone, which we can basically use interchangeably with thyroxine, okay? When we say thyroid hormone, we're actually talking about two different but pretty similar compounds. So the two chemicals that make up thyroid hormone are T3 and T4. They're mentioning their structure here. 2 tyrosine molecules attached to 4 iodine atoms, or 2 tyrosine molecules attached to 3 iodine atoms. So the only difference is whether you're using 3 or 4 iodines. Other than that, they're about the same. Thyroid hormone is one of the most widely acting hormones in all of the endocrine system. Affects virtually every cell in the body. We talked about this a little bit before. What is the role of thyroid hormone? What does it actually do?
Your metabolism keeps it.
Yeah, it regulates cellular metabolism. So more thyroid hormone equals faster metabolism. It speeds up all of the chemical processes. Low thyroid hormone, low cellular metabolism. And again, affecting basically every cell in the body. So that's what they're mentioning right here. Increases metabolic rate. And now importantly, it mentions heat production because if you think of all of these chemical reactions as basically like burning fuel, right? You're increasing the rate at which you're metabolizing things. One of the products that's released as a result of that is heat. Yes, chemical waste products, but also heat. So they talk about its calorogenic effect, which just means heat production. And for example, this is one of the things that tends to increase when, say, you have a fever, right? You guys know how that works. Your body has a set point that it likes to maintain its temperature at, right? But when you have an infection of some kind, it's helpful to fight that off if your temperature goes up. And one of the things that happens is an increase in thyroid hormone production to create more heat and maintain that higher level of body temperature. We'll talk about disorders of thyroid hormone here in a few minutes, but one of the symptoms of low thyroid hormone, for example, is a low body temperature. One of the symptoms of high thyroid hormone is an increase in body temperature. So that's what it's doing in most of us, regulating cellular metabolism. Early in life, thyroid hormone also has an important role to play in the development of important systems like and especially the nervous system. They're mentioning skeletal and nervous systems. We'll see that play into a specific disorder here in just a few minutes. So as I said, thyroid hormone is produced in sort of an unusual way. For most of these hormones, they're produced inside the cell, they're released, and they diffuse into the bloodstream, but not thyroid hormone. It says here, the thyroid gland stores the hormone extracellularly. Remember those big cisterns, the thyroid follicles? It's actually produced in there. So the cells of the follicular cells that we looked at, they produce this stuff called thyroglobulin. It's one of the precursors or ingredients in thyroid hormone. And then you will also transport iodide ions from the bloodstream, and they're all sort of mixed together there in those thyroid follicles where the thyroid hormone is actually produced. And then it's brought across the follicular cells again to be dispersed into the bloodstream. Here's what it looks like. Okay? Here's one of the cells. They produce this stuff called thyroglobulin. They release that into the follicle. Then iodide ions are also brought into the follicle where they're mixed with thyroglobulin to produce our hormones T3 and T4. That stuff is then brought back across the cell and into the bloodstream. So it's actually made in the lumen of the follicle rather than within the cells themselves. Kind of an interesting thing about iodine, we probably know that it's a necessary nutrient. You've heard that before. You see it on, like they always make a big deal about that on the salt. When you buy salt in the store, it's iodized a lot of times, okay? But this is basically the only process that you need iodine for, metabolically, is the synthesis of thyroid hormone. But because it is such an important hormone, it's very necessary that you have adequate levels of iodine to produce adequate amounts of thyroid hormone. So we mentioned that thyroid hormone is actually these two separate compounds, T3 and T4. Well, what's the difference? We know one of the differences is molecular. T3 has 3 iodine atoms and T4 has 4 iodine atoms. And they both activate the same receptors, but look at this. T3 is 10 times more potent than T4. So it has a much stronger effect. And look at this first statement here. Both of them are transported by thyroxine-binding globulins. Now, we've already talked a little bit about what that is. What is the meaning of this statement here? Explain what we're reading.
Under fat soluble something?
Yeah, it's a fat-soluble hormone. And this is the specific transport protein in the blood that picks up and gives a ride to thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone, being fat-soluble, needs to be transported on one of these globulins. And when it arrives at a cell, because it's fat-soluble, how will it activate it?
By entering it?
Yeah, it'll cross the membrane and activate an intracellular receptor. Very good. Production of thyroid hormone by the thyroid gland is regulated by a hormonal stimulus. So that one of the anterior pituitary hormones we looked at last time was TSH. What does that stand for?
Thyroid stimulating.
Thyroid stimulating hormone. When we talk about this being regulated by a hormonal stimulus, it is a hormone causing the thyroid to produce another hormone. In this case, TSH stimulates the thyroid to produce thyroid hormone. And as we kind of talked about last time, this works basically the same way in all of the hormonal axes, all of the hormonally controlled hormones of our body. We've got a negative feedback loop, right? So in these hormonal axes, where does it almost always start? The hypothalamus. So remember, as I mentioned at the beginning of class, this that we're going over here right now, this is going to be part of the fill in the blank, okay? What we're explaining right now. So when it comes to production of thyroid hormone, we begin in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will produce what?
TRH.
TRH, a thyrotropin releasing hormone that acts on the anterior pituitary. What does the pituitary produce?
The TSH.
The TSH. That acts on the thyroid, stimulating production of thyroid hormone. And like all of these hormonal axes, I said it's a negative feedback loop. So rising levels of thyroid hormone have an inhibitory effect on the production of TSH and TRH. And in this way you achieve sort of a natural balance, right? If these levels start to drop, then this beginning part of the axis will accelerate, resulting in more production. If levels of this start to go up, we inhibit the beginning part of it to again balance it out. And in a healthy person, in a person whose endocrine system is functioning properly, it should achieve that natural balance. Now, as we know, problems with thyroid hormone are very common, right? People have problems with their thyroid pretty commonly. It can be very tricky to treat because if you exhibit the symptoms and say you measure blood levels of thyroid hormone and they're low, and you have the symptoms of low thyroid hormone levels, where's the issue? Well, it's not always so easy to find out, right? Because could the problem be in your thyroid? Sure. But could it also be in your hypothalamus or in your pituitary? Any one of the links in the chain could be disturbed. So let's think about that a little bit and see if we can figure some of these things out. Let's say I'm exhibiting the symptoms of low thyroid hormone production, okay? And I get a blood panel done, and I see that my thyroid hormone levels are low, but my TSH levels are high. Where would you think the problem might lie?
In the thyroid.
In the thyroid itself, right? Because your levels are low, but you have plenty of TSH. In fact, you have a higher than normal amount. It's your body's way of saying, hey, come on, get it going, right? How about if thyroid hormone and TSH are both low, but TRH is high?
Pituitary.
The pituitary is underproducing, right? Your hypothalamus is trying to stimulate it, but it's underproducing the TSH, resulting in low thyroid hormone levels. So that could be a way to approach that. What's that?
I said, talking about this, I forgot to take my thyroid.
Starting to feel cold?
I'm always
You're always cold, yeah.
I'm about to move over there because this is blowing right on my neck.
All right, let's talk about disorders related to thyroid hormones, since as we mentioned, they're pretty common. As we're going to find out with basically all of the different hormones, there can sort of be two issues, right? Too much or too little, okay? With thyroid hormone, as it turns out, it kind of depends on what stage of life you're talking about. But let's go first with hyposecretion. In adults, we call that myxedema. Although, to be honest, I don't think that term is really super common. Most people would say something like hypothyroid, or hypothyroidism. But that is a hyposecretion. There's a thing called a goiter, which does have low thyroid hormone levels associated with it. But when you think of a goiter, what's the main thing you think of?
My dad attacking my neck and saying, got your goiter?
Well, okay. Usually when you think of a goiter, you think of a growth, right?
Yeah.
A goiter is a hyperplasia of the thyroid gland itself. So this boy here has a goiter, and that's what the lump is on his neck. Like we saw in the previous slide, it's as a result of a dietary deficiency of iodine. Anybody want to guess why not getting enough iodine could cause your thyroid gland to grow? Why don't we back up to the hormonal axis here? Oh, when were you going to say
Well,
something?
I was gonna say, don't you need the iodine to move the thyroid? Or maybe it's like the thyroid is building up there, or the,
Oh, well, you know, that's not a bad idea. The other ingredients are something sort of building up and swelling the follicles, but that's actually not what's happening. We need iodine as an ingredient in thyroid hormone, right? It's one of the things that we use to make it. But if you're not getting enough iodine, you won't be able to produce it. These levels will be low, right? What happens when levels of thyroid hormone are low? How does that affect the beginning part of the axis?
the overworked? Or,
Well, you're on the right track. This accelerates, right? Production of TRH and TSH. So you continue stimulating the gland, but without the right ingredients, it can't make the product. So I think we talked a little bit last time about how understimulation of a tissue can cause it to atrophy, right? Well, overstimulation of a tissue can cause it to grow. And that's what's happening with a goiter. You can't produce enough thyroid hormone, not because there's a problem with any of this, but because you're not consuming the right ingredients in your diet. So these levels are low, the thyroid gland gets essentially overstimulated by the production of extra TRH and TSH, and it grows as a response. And that's how you end up with a goiter.
what kind of foods would have iodine in